It was a great line from the head of one of the hedge funds I worked for. It was always stuck in my head. And he said, money is the byproduct of success. He said, you focus on being really good at your job.
Cool, Connor.
Hello.
Thanks for coming in. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
I know who you are, but some people watching this won't. So very high level. Would you mind giving just rough steer on background?
So my name is Connor White. I guess I'm a technologist. I've been working in technology for nearly 30 years, which was quite scary. Almost entirely in the world of financial services. I had a brief spell. I worked in Sweden for a year in a logistics company, worked for 6 months in Brussels in a mobile phone company, and then came to London and went back into finance and specifically into the world of banking. And then about 20 years ago, I made a switch from banking into the hedge fund world, and I've been in that world ever since.
Yeah.
So it originally started as kind of a quant developer, kind of got into more senior roles, ultimately ended up leading teams, doing a lot of different stuff. I'm still focused on a lot of technology, but even ended up doing stuff like dealing with auditors, regulators, all sorts of other interesting stuff I've gotten involved with over the years.
Cool. And funds. So we used to, the first tranche of podcasts we did, I always used to ask people like, what do you think of recruiters and word association, stuff like that. But as this is evolving, it's becoming much more of the viewership is becoming much more centered around technologists and people in finance, and far less around recruiters and what they think. So the thing that I want to talk about initially is just hedge funds kind of generally, because it's a world that a lot of people in technology want to try and transition their career into for a number of different reasons. But it's also a world where there's massive variation from like shop to shop to shop. And also not too many people really understand it if you haven't experienced it. So your backgrounds, naturally, you've seen a lot of different looks. Broad strokes perspective, like from more of a human level, how would you kind of categorize the big differences that you've seen over time between historical experience in sell side and then the last 20 years, as you mentioned, in different versions of buy side roles from just a human-led expectation perspective?
Is that expectation of recruiters? Or?
No, on an individual who's working in those environments.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, the one difference, stark difference between a buy side firm and a sell side firm is going to be the size of the organization. So if you're in a big bank, you could be in a multi-thousand person IT team. The business lines you're associated with could be staffed by people in another building or in another country or far away from you, and you might not have a lot of interaction with them. And because there's so many people, you can become very specialized in one area. What also I've observed from my own experience on the buy or on the sell side and from interviewing people on the sell side is, not only are you siloed, but they all have these big frameworks and everyone's expected to operate in these technical type frameworks. So someone at a high level has built some technical framework and every application will be built within this framework for better or worse. And if you're someone who's gone into a bank and grown up in that framework, that's often all you know. And an awful lot of complexity has been taken care of for you. You just sit there focusing on your small little problem set. And that works for the banks. It's great for them. And it can make staff sticky as well, because it's harder for them to leave. You suddenly leave that and you go into a small hedge fund, which is, the entire hedge fund team is 200 people and maybe 30, 40 tech people in there. That whole framework that you're used to operating with, the whole support ecosystem that exists in a bank just isn't there.
Yeah.
There's so much more you got to be able to do for yourself. You could be in a bank, you kind of write some code, you check it in, it goes off to a testing team, it goes off somewhere else, and eventually it ends up in a production environment, and you might never see it again, and then you just work on your next ticket. If you're in a hedge fund, you're talking to the end user directly, you're kind of gathering the requirements, you're doing the analysis, you're proposing the solution, you're implementing it, you're testing it. You're working on your rollout in the post-production phase of that, and there's a feedback loop because they're going to come back to you with direct feedback. There's so many more things you get exposed to. There's so much more responsibility. And with that comes, if something goes wrong, you feel the pain directly. Whereas in a bank, you might be well insulated from that. Or in a bank, you might be able to hide away because you're part of a team of hundreds of people, and accountability can
And when you
fly
say
around.
feel the pain directly, do you mean like you're accountable for what you've done?
Yeah, because you're in a small firm.
Yeah.
There's only a few people and you might be dealing directly with a trader.
Yeah.
And traders can be
Yeah.
uncompromising people sometimes and very forthright.
Yeah.
So it's a very different world. And I've seen people, not just in tech, but I've seen in my time, people in lots of professions, like who come in from the finance side, from the risk side, even trading side, coming from banks to hedge funds, really struggling because they're used to this big support ecosystem all around them.
When you moved, so say 20 years ago, the transition was made, was it the same? So, because I assume now, like from what I see and everything you've said is sort of, I see it every day in dealing with funds and trying to help them hire and that sort of thing. When you went in, was everything built? Was everything vertically siloed so much in the sell side? Or was it a little bit flatter then, a little bit less structured, where actually the transition was a little bit easier?
Everything was still very vertically siloed.
Right, okay.
And it was, I was in a big, large bank. There must have been 20,000 people in the tech team globally. Right. I remember I was part of this tech arc group and we were building a whole load of components to be shared amongst other development teams. So I was quite far removed from the business side of things. So our customers were ultimately other development teams that we were building. We were building the frameworks and the common components for them to use. And our managing director at the time had big ambitions for us and we're going to push this and we're going to grow our footprint in the organization. And I remember being on a drinks night out with the firm one night where we met lots of other people in the tech team, the tech organization. And I remember meeting another group of people who were doing the exact same thing as us. And we were not aware of them and they were not aware of us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there was all these massive silos. They're all solving the same problems. They're all doing things. And everyone's off building these kind of frameworks and ecosystems for everyone to operate within, So that was true then. I haven't been on the sell side for 20 years. So,
yeah.
But from the people I've interviewed and based on their experiences, I suspect that's still the case.
Yeah, for sure. And was it an easy transition for you?
It was because I loved it. Was. So my very first job in banking in Dublin, I had a maths degree and they hired me because they wanted someone to work in a risk system.
Right.
And this was the 1990s when risk was suddenly becoming a thing. It was relatively new. And so I was working quite closely with the business on that. And I came in from a maths angle and learned how to program on the job. And I was quite close to the business there. But then as I kind of moved around a bit and then ended up in the big bank in this tech arc team where I grew a lot technically and I learned an awful lot technically, but I got very far removed from the business. I kind of reached the point where I wanted to get back close to the business and close to where the money was made.
Yeah.
I felt I'd learned what I wanted to learn there. But like you say, like that experience of meeting people doing the exact same work as us. And I just thought, this is kind of pointless.
Yeah.
So when I went back, and I mean, one of my other frustrations and that sort of things was just the timelines for projects. I mean, 6 months was a short delivery cycle back then.
I guess everything was like waterfall back then as well.
Yeah, it was, or you'd be halfway through a project and they'd suddenly change direction and you just abandon what you're doing halfway through. You could try it 6 months. So it was, I was keen for something different.
Yeah.
So yeah, then suddenly I was on a trading desk in a hedge fund. Sitting, when the people all around me were traders or quants, not other developers. And there was all sorts of crazy stuff going on around me. And but
Are you in London at that point?
This was in London, yes. And then they had all sorts of systems. And I remember looking at one of the systems kind of going, that bank I was at spent 2 years trying to do that and they didn't achieve it and you have it here. And,
yeah.
Oh my God. And then, initially I'd be talking to some of the developers who built that in the US and say, can we change this, change that? And they were like, the next day it was, here you go, you have it. And then I started writing code. So I had my end user sitting beside me. If I had a question, I didn't have to arrange a meeting or, write an email or do whatever or phone them up. I just literally turned to the person to my left or right and asked them a question.
Yeah.
And I was able to write software very iteratively, kind of continually query, this is what I'm doing, is this right, is this wrong? As soon as I had it built, they were kind of go, great, let's run it.
Yeah. It's just the pace of
no
iteration.
process, no whatever. You know, things are slightly different now because there's regulation has crept in there, but still, relative to a bank, that you're delivering continuously. You're a lot closer to the end user. And I guess one other thing that struck me at the time was, again, you're in a big bank. You got compliance department, you got operations, you got risk, corporate research, trading, research. There's all these different people, and they're all their own silos, and they all might sit in different buildings or different floors or whatever, and quite far from each other. In that environment, it was you need to talk to compliance, as in that person there, or you need to talk to operations, that person sitting over there. Everyone was in one room together.
Yeah.
So the ability to kind of talk to someone, consult with them, get a decision made quickly was a revelation after coming out of a bank where everything just stuff took forever.
Yeah.
And we were just able to iterate rapidly and deliver quickly, and it was, and I loved the environment, and I thought it was great. Other people came in and really struggled in that environment. They just, again, they were first of all, they were used to the support ecosystem that the bank provides you, this nice little comforting blanket, whereas I felt confident enough technically, I guess because maybe I worked on the frameworks rather than within the frameworks. I felt I had the technical skills, and so I was comfortable doing more stuff for myself. And I was just comfortable in that environment dealing with non-technical people. And
the people that
traders.
struggled, was it just the nakedness of not having the wider ecosystem? Was that the real pinch point, or was it the speed, or just a bit of everything?
It was all of the above.
Yeah.
And then it's if you're in a tech department and all your colleagues are other tech people, you're talking about a certain type of person. If you're suddenly on a trading floor dealing with traders, they're just different mentalities and different personality types you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And it's horses for courses. Some people love it. Some people just they just can't deal with that.
Yeah. And your career naturally evolved into leadership over time. Was that always the plan? Like, did you see yourself as being a guy who was going to become a tech leader, or was it more organic as the career evolved?
Kind of high level in the back of my head, like, it's always, anyone with any bit of ambition wants to kind of get promoted and grow and like that. But at the time I went in, I was very much focused on the job at hand and trying to just do as good a job as I could in that environment. And I was enjoying doing it. So in the first couple of years there, I got on great with everyone. I kind of established myself there, and I built my brand and my reputation. I was able to deliver for the traders. They were giving me good reports. So it all worked in my favor. So I enjoyed all of that. And then it was kind of my bosses in the US were suddenly, we need to build this guy up and we need to put a team under him.
Yeah.
And so I didn't go chasing it. It kind of came somewhat organically.
Yeah.
But
is that how it tends to work? Like in most funds, particularly smaller funds, of the onus is more on the individual to put yourself in the window of look, you naturally need to give me this stuff, as opposed to it being preordained of like a really structured route based on this is what happens next and what happens next.
It's more organic. It's more. It's a lot of it comes down to your ability to deliver.
Yeah.
And it's and I suppose it gets into the whole question of what makes someone successful in that environment. What are the attributes that matter? And I guess how I think about it is, and when I went into the environment at the time, I wasn't necessarily thinking about it that way. I was interested in the environment. I was focused on doing as good a job as possible.
Yeah.
But I guess a good way to sit back and think about it is, first of all, what your role is when you go into this place. So first and foremost, you got to ask yourself, what is a hedge fund? I'll try to give my non-investment professional's view of what a hedge fund is, but it's an investment vehicle. They're trying to get superior returns for their investors. And specifically, like any hedge fund worth their salt, what they want to do is they want to beat the risk-free rate of return. So as in, if you've got £1 million to invest, you have multiple choices of what you can do with that money. So if you want to, you can lend that to the British government and buy a British government bond, and you'll get about, I think right now you get about 4%.
Yeah.
So that's effectively your risk-free rate of return, because the British government are highly unlikely to default.
Yeah.
And if they do, all bets are off anyway.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. So that 4%, so any investment you make other than that is realistically, you got to be doing better than 4%.
Yeah.
So, and if you're a hedge fund manager, they're highly cognizant of that. So everything they're focused on is returns for their investors. And especially if you look at a long only fund who manages your pension, like they're charging a fraction of a percent of the funds invested for their services. If you're in a hedge fund, they're charging typically 2% of the funds plus 20% of the profits.
Yeah.
So, which are very chunky fees. So they gotta justify that. So they gotta not only beat that risk-free rate of return, they really gotta outperform that if they want to justify their existence.
So someone coming in tech, so you mentioned like the first thing is you got to understand the environment you're joining, and you got to know what is a hedge fund and the focus of performance. How does that feed through?
So part of it is if you're coming in as a technologist, first and foremost, we're assuming you're at a certain technical level, or you're a certain level of ability or technical level, and you're smart enough to be in that seat. You might have a lot of learning to do about the environment, but you're not working for a pure technology company. Your business isn't technology. Your business is ultimately making those returns for investors. So whatever you're working on ultimately has to align with that goal, because they have the top level goal of the business. You might have different trading teams, each running different strategies. They might have specific needs will come out of that kind of suddenly come down to requirements for tech people or for quants or operations. But ultimately, we're all part of that ecosystem to support that ultimate goal of making returns for investors. And it's something you always have to have in the back of your head. So you're still going to be dealing with deep technical stuff. But the ultimate point of what you're doing is to help make those returns.
Yeah.
And often that means even though you're not taking risk or investment decisions yourself, you're supporting the people who are, and you're trying to make their life as easy as possible and make them as efficient as possible. And in some cases, when you get into systematic trading, you're getting right down into the intellectual property of the firm itself, of how to make money, and you're helping them implement that.
Yeah.
I've seen people, where, again, you're in a bank, you could be in a giant IT department, you might have a liaison department with the trading team where you have people dedicated to talking to them and are the kind of bridge between the two sides. So you might not even talk to your end users. Again, you're in a hedge fund, you're talking directly with all your business sponsors. There's always exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, they don't care about the intricacies of the tech you're working on.
Yeah.
You can sit there and talk about some nice design pattern or some technical problem you're having or something, and you can see people giving updates on that type of stuff, and you can see everyone's eyes glaze over. They're not interested. So when you're talking to non-tech people, they're interested in features, the functionality, they have a problem that they want solved. Do you understand their problem? And they want a progress update on how you're solving that problem for them. And then the more senior the person you're talking to, the more they just care about when are we getting this. They're high level looking at, we need X, Y, Z to achieve this business goal. When are we getting this? That's all that matters to them. So while within your own little tech world inside a hedge fund, you're going to be having in-depth tech conversations. When you're talking to those other people, you got to learn. You have to be very focused on what they care about and what matters to them.
Yeah.
And they're happy to let you kind of deal with that internal tech stuff. They're very much interested in what they're getting. They're not too worried about the implementation. And again, you'll see a lot of developers will come a cropper on that because they can be. I've seen people who are brilliant they'll ace every technical interview. But they can have a very academic mindset, and they're very focused on this problem and engineering it, the perfect solution to this, and they're worried about kind of gold plating every little part of it. And where at the other end, very often you have someone saying, "Look, we need a solution." This week, next week, whatever. We don't have time to wait for this forever. And so the people who are successful kind of get what they're there for. They're there to bring their skill set to the table to help solve business problems. And ultimately, solving those business problems helps the firm be better and make more money and make more returns for investors.
That's something I learned really early dealing with hedge funds, even as a recruiter. I mean, I'd predominantly deal with tech people, but people that have been there a while. So they were very much would perform in that manner. And I learned straight away, like, if you're going to take their time and ask a question, it's like, it better bloody be a good question and an intelligent one, because they didn't care. It was just outcome. Like, we need this. This is like, it's important to us. Go away, deliver. And if you're going to use our time up, don't waste it with like, you haven't listened or you don't understand enough or whatever. Tell us what you need, and then we're going to expect a result. And you can feel it, as a third party, that concept of like delivery and outcome, and trying to understand what are their problems. They don't care about us. So like, how do we just add value? And I've always found like, the more we just do that, the more they want to bring us into the tent, because we're seen as people that can provide. But it's interesting that you say that then that bleeds in on the tech side. And I'd imagine then it becomes much more about like, the technical chops, and there's an assumption that you're bringing the skills to the table, but communication skills, big picture, kind of empathy, conscientiousness becomes so much more important for an individual to thrive in those companies versus just raw, here's my academics and this is what I've built historically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's, and again, if you're in a bank, there's 5 people doing that role.
Yeah.
There's someone doing, just a business analyst, there's developers, you might have a testing team, you might have someone whose job it is to talk to the traders. You're doing all of those things.
Yeah.
In a hedge fund. I loved it. Other people hate it,
Yeah.
It very much depends on the person,
So as you progressed, naturally you needed to build teams and that sort of thing. Did you find it tough to assess for those more like nuanced traits in individuals?
Yeah. So, and, it's always hard to generalize, but, it depends on who you're hiring. Or depends the specific role you're hiring for. If you're a high frequency prop shop looking for ultra low latency engineers, a lot of what I said may not be relevant. You want those academic people who can do deep research in technology.
Yeah.
Once you get out of that space, everything I said becomes relevant. And then it's, so first and foremost, you want to just assess their technical skills and make sure that there's some depth to what they know. And again, you might see it in the banks of you've got someone who's operated in a framework in the bank, and so much complexity was taken care of for them, and they've never had the curiosity to look beyond what they were doing to try and understand how does this framework work. Those people tend to fail pretty quickly in the interview process. You want someone with a bit of depth. They'll say, we had to use this framework, and then they can talk about the pros and cons of the framework, how it worked, what its limitations were, and they can be opinionated on that. And then, that's a good conversation to have. But you want to make sure, and again, if they say, if you're looking for a Python engineer, you want to go into some of the more advanced Python concepts and make sure that they do know it.
Yeah.
So that's important. Or if it's a C++ person, again, I don't tend to focus too much on syntax or some of the trick questions of, they missed that little comma here or whatever. It's more, can they talk about some of the more advanced features of those languages?
Yeah.
When you'd use them, when it's appropriate to use them, when it's not appropriate. What are the challenges? So it's that type of conversation. And that was certainly how I interviewed in the earlier days. And then obviously, like everyone, your people's style will evolve over time. How I've tended to do things in more recent years is, the question I will ask someone is, pick a body of work, something preferably recent that you worked on, a project that you're proud of. It might have been just you, or it might have been as part of a team. And let's talk about that. And what I want them to do is say, first of all, before we even get near technology, I want you to describe the business problem you were trying to solve.
Yeah.
What was the business problem? Who were the stakeholders? Do you know that? And for some people that's hard because they're in a big silo in some bank somewhere, but the best people are the ones who had that curiosity to find out. Even though the lazy approach is just sit in your silo and not bother to look outside the window.
Yeah.
But you will get the people then who can articulate that. They understand the reason behind what they were doing.
Yeah.
And you get a good sense of their business domain knowledge. And if they don't have that at all, that's always a red flag, because you might struggle in a hedge fund without that. And then it's a case of start drilling down into was there an existing system and you had to kind of change that existing system, and what were the challenges you faced? Was it a whole greenfield development? And get into the kind of, well, what was the design you went for? What were the technical challenges? What technical tools did you choose to build with?
Yeah.
And again, sometimes they're going to be part of a team, or they might have been taken direction from above. But I just want to get into that. Did they kind of have that kind of broader view of the project that they were working on? Or were they just someone's getting kind of tickets and just writing some code and handing it back? And the people I want are those people who are able to, they've got the depth technically, but they understood why they were doing what they were doing and how it solved some problem in the business organization that they were in. And then from there you can go down into you don't really need to do the kind of the technical questions. You can just start drilling into the technology they use, why they used it, what were the challenges, and then you can get into very in-depth technical questions.
Yeah.
But which technical questions I ask is very much a function of where the conversation goes or what the problem they're describing is.
Yeah.
That process somewhat mirrors what it would be like to work with someone, because ultimately you're going to be in a situation where you're presented with a business problem. You got to find a solution to it. And then you're going to sit in a room with a bunch of tech people and debate what that solution is and come to some agreement, and then you're going to have to deliver it and do all of that. So that conversation in the interview kind of mirrors what it's going to be like to work with someone, and you get a sense of how they think about things. And then and so generally that's how I would do things. But again, there's always exceptions, because if it's a like for like hire, if it's someone doing the same role I'm trying to hire for in another hedge fund, it'll be very much all over that type of questioning.
Yeah.
If it's if it's an out of industry hire, if it's someone who's coming from outside of financial services who works in a pure tech firm, I'll probably try to adapt the questioning around that. Because that's a different type of hire you're making then. Obviously, again, the technical skills matter, but it's very much, for me, it's more you're hiring the person, not the skill set.
Yeah.
It's about then trying to form an assessment of that person and how they solve problems, how to work with other people. And again, make sure they have some depth to their technicality as well. But most of the people we would interview will be coming from banks or other hedge funds.
Yeah.
So it's very important that they have that context.
Yeah. I was smirking slightly because a previous guest, Donald McCarthy, I asked him a similar question and he basically had the same answer. So he said, tell me about the project that you've worked on that you're most proud of. And if that answer takes 30 seconds, it kind of tells you everything that you need to know. But the really good people, if you give them that framework of you can give me as much detail as you feel is necessary, they'll tell you about the problem, who the users were, how they engaged with it, how it was built, ground up, and they'll demonstrate the understanding of like the whys and the hows. And you can glean, then it's just prompting to try and dig a little bit deeper into things that you want to go into. And so we placed a guy recently with a quant fund, and his feedback from the interview was like, they didn't really ask me any questions. He's like, all they asked was like, what have you built? How did you build it? Why did you build it like that? How would you take it to the next level? And they're basically just like, why? And it was just a conversation. And it's like, they just didn't really ask me much. And they came out saying he's great. Like he just understands it, he gets it. And I think that's an important point for a lot of people coming in, is a really good interviewer is not going to ask you very much. They're going to give you the space to demonstrate your capability or not otherwise. And then, like you say, the eyes are going to glaze over, pretty quickly if you're on that side of the fence thinking, God, I've got to sit through another one of these. And when's the right time to pull the plug? Were you pretty ruthless on it, or did you give them if someone messed up that first question, like, is there a chance to redeem themselves?
I'll generally be polite, and generally sometimes you just suffer us through just for the sake of being nice to people and polite. I remember I had one very painful one where the guy just could not enter into a conversation. And I was 15 minutes in and I went, look, thank you very much for your time. Because it was impossible. But generally you're not going to be a dick to people, you'll try to be nice, whatever, and keep the process.
Do you, to swing it into recruitment slightly, because it's kind of where I come from with it, but do you lean on recruiters quite heavily to maybe give you the bits in the gap? Because I'd imagine like CVs over a period of time, you're looking at like brand names, academics, what have they done? But it's very difficult to get under the hood on a CV. So do you need recruiters to be saying, look, we've asked a lot of these questions and this is what they've built. We're recommending this person, or is it much more like, they probably don't have the skill set necessarily to do that anyway, but do you find you've got to kiss a lot of frogs to get that individual?
You've got to kiss a lot of frogs. Yeah. So, so the bad recruiters are, if I say I want someone who's a C++ programmer and they send me a CV of someone who's only got Java, I'm just like, come on.
Yeah.
So, and they are out there. It still exists. So like that's a bit painful. A good recruiter obviously gets the simple stuff right. You can do the basic matching. It's my job to assess their skills. If they say they're a C++ programmer, it's my job to assess that. It's not the recruiter's job. The good recruiters are the ones who, obviously get that right. But, if I'm looking for someone who can be a developer on a trading desk and has got experience of long, short equities or fixed income or something, the good recruiters know all the people doing that job around London.
Yeah.
They know who the funds are and they know the people.
Yeah.
And then that's a great conversation because then you can kind of go, are those people looking to move? Can we approach them?
Yeah.
So that's brilliant kind of service from a recruiter if you can do that. But often that's not the case of there isn't an exact match for the person you want, or that person doesn't want to move. And then you got to start considering other people and you need to start looking at a broader array of people. Yeah. So in that case, I want them to get some basics right, but then show me a wide range of people. Because there's lots of people who don't have direct experience of those roles, but might really want to do it and might be really good at it. They just don't have the experience yet.
Yeah. So you're quite comfortable to keep it on recruitment just for the minute. Mm-hmm. If agencies are coming to you and saying, look, we're going to give you a breadth, mm-hmm. and 95%, 99%, whatever, are not going to be right. Mm-hmm. And you are, through this method, you are going to have to kiss the frogs, mm-hmm. but you're comfortable with us working this way, provided we do get the one.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe frogs is the wrong term. They're just,
no, but you know what I mean.
They're just not the right people for the roles.
Because at the end of the day, it's still time investment. And I've always had a slightly different opinion of it, mm-hmm. where I can't test anyone technically and I wouldn't try to. But the things that I can try and test for are more of the qualitative in the gap stuff around, if you can explain to me the problems that you're solving through your work in X organization, it will give me more confidence they can explain it to you. Yeah. Because I'm not that I'm not that difficult to convince because I'm ignorant. So if I ask people questions about who are your stakeholders and why is it important to them, and they sort of mutter and stutter their way through it, that would be someone to me where I go, regardless of how they look on paper, I'm just not going to send them. My goal has always been to try and send the least amount of CVs mm-hmm. to get the outcome. Yeah. Because in my head, I'm sort of thinking, if you can achieve what you consider to be a great hire and invest less hours, mm-hmm. those hours can be spent on other things. Yes. So it's trying to find the balance between giving you enough looks mm-hmm. that you feel like you've had you've seen the spread, but at the same time not being like one of those agencies where it's like they're just continually throwing stuff against the wall, hoping that one day some stuff sticks. Yeah, and it's so certainly again, if I'd engaged with you on a hire, I could talk to you about what the interview process is going to look like. You can tell the people this is roughly the line of questioning you're going to get. Yeah. So they're prepped for it. That if you claim to know Python, be prepared to answer in-depth questions on it. Yeah. If you have some technical skill in your CV and you're not able to talk about it, that's bad. So make sure that they're comfortable talking about anything. And if there's any technical skill they don't want to talk about, don't put it on your CV. So you can manage them that way. And just tell them, I'm happy to share kind of some of the questions in advance and kind of tell them this is how the conversation is going to go. This is what you're going to have to do. Well, I think general rule of thumb, don't have things on your CV that you can't stand on. If it's there, then it's fair game to be questioned on it.
And what's useful as well is, again, everyone's got different experiences. They've worked in parts of teams where they were kind of bit part players. They weren't running everything. That type of questioning I outlined a while ago, if you start misrepresenting yourself or start saying you did things that you didn't really do that other people were doing, that can come out pretty easily in that line of questioning. Yeah. You can get found out very quickly. Yeah. So don't, I'm much happier for someone to say, look, I didn't do that, and put their hands up. I don't know that, or I didn't, someone else did that bit, and just be honest with me. And then, we can move the conversation on, versus when people start trying to make stuff up and it becomes obvious after a while.
Yeah.
So, so you can help prep the candidates in advance for me and tell them, just be upfront and honest.
Yeah.
Sometimes we understand someone isn't an exact match, but, and in that scenario, we're looking for the person, not the skill set,
On that, so I get a lot of messages privately from people that have watched this and these episodes and stuff that work in banks currently, and they're probably coming out of environments where they're quite siloed. They don't have necessarily like the breadth to get close to, the business, for example, whatever it is. Are there things that people can be doing, particularly younger and like mid-level people on their way up still, that would resonate with someone like yourself, where outside of the confines of your day job, these are the things that you've done, and this gives me confidence that you're someone I want to talk to regardless?
Yeah. I mean, certainly show an interest in the industry, and there's lots of literature, there's lots of research you can do in your own time. So you do your research, understand the specific firm you're going to, but also the wider industry that they operate in. So it's perfectly good to come into an interview and say, look, I don't have direct experience of any of this, but I've read a lot about it. I'm really interested. I really want to learn about this. And I find this an exciting, challenging area.
Yeah.
It's always possible. There's always a way in the door. But you got to show the enthusiasm, and you got to show the willingness to kind of do your own work. And that will kind of stand out if you've done that.
Yeah.
Because, an obvious question a lot of people will just ask, well, why do you want to leave a bank and go to a hedge fund?
Yeah.
And again, I've had people say, oh, because the money's better, which is the worst possible
Not a good answer.
Yeah. And pretty clearly the hedge funds do pay better than the banks, but you're going to work a lot harder. You're going to have a lot more responsibility. But if you're there purely for the money, and that's all this, if that's your only motivation, you might not succeed.
Yeah. It also makes you quite hard to invest in. Like, if you're going to hire someone, it's only a matter of time before someone else is going to turn up and offer, like another recruiter is going to be in their inbox saying, come and do it over here and they'll pay you more.
Yeah.
And if you're bringing in people where they're very overtly, I'm here for the money, it must make a question of like, well, I'm less inclined to make an investment over time in you as a person, because you might be gone in 12 months. And
in the long run, it never works out for those people.
Yeah.
It was a great line from the head of one of the hedge funds I worked for. It's always stuck in my head. And he said, money is the byproduct of success. He said, you focus on being really good at your job.
Yeah.
And, if you nail the job and you do everything perfectly, the money, the promotions, all that other stuff will naturally follow from it.
Yeah.
But it's all about doing great work.
There's a guy called Greg Glassman who created CrossFit, which I think he sold it years later for billions. And he was on some business thing that I watched, and he was saying like the mistake a lot of people make is they go after money, and he was saying if you chase money, the markets will laugh at you. But if you focus on doing every part of your job exceptionally well, the markets will reward you with money. And it's that passion and interest in the subject matter and just doing a good job. Like you said at the beginning, like your evolution in the funds wasn't a mapped out plan. It was, I was just head down focused on doing the best job I could possibly do. And then the leadership were going, right, we need to push this guy, because that's where your focus was.
Yeah, exactly.
And then slightly off topic, but the big vogue at the moment is obviously around AI. Naturally, it's going to have impact on tech and trading, and there's going to be numerous potential implications, good and bad, and everything else. I suppose keeping it within the prism of technology, how do you see it evolving? What sort of effects do you think it's going to have on engineering in general and technology's application into capital markets?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of right now, obviously lots of people are using ChatGPT and Copilot, and there's certainly been productivity gains from that. What I've observed is, and what I've heard anecdotally is, obviously you can be typing away, writing your code, and then Copilot suddenly auto-completes the next 20, 30 lines of code. And people go, wow, that's amazing. And it's a massive productivity boost. And also where if you're using a new library or some API you haven't used before, you very often, you don't even end up having to read the documentation. You just kind of type into the little prompt, I want to use this, and it will generate the code for you. So you can become very productive, obviously. And that far more productive than we would have been a couple of years ago. I think some of those productivity gains are being offset by the fact that it can generate all this code, which looks perfect, but it does make subtle mistakes. And people are losing time kind of debugging code. And part of the problem is you're effectively debugging someone else's code because you didn't write it. Whereas if I wrote that code yourself, very often you very quickly know where you've gone wrong.
Yeah.
But you're effectively finding the problems in someone else's code. I think that's a short-term issue there. I think it's, there certainly has been a productivity boost from that. What we're also seeing as well is you got to get a developer who's maybe very proficient in Python, but not very good at JavaScript or web development. But because they're a good developer, they've got the engineering mindset, and they need to build a web front end, but they're not very good at that side of things. They know the right questions to ask the large language model. And they can get a good response out of it. So they can suddenly find themselves writing JavaScript, and the Copilot will kind of correct them as they go along. So they can become much more productive in languages they're not necessarily familiar with. Where do I think it's going to go long term? Like, all predictions are tricky and possibly worthless, but my 2 pence worth is the models are going to get ever more sophisticated. There's more and more people coming out of universities with PhDs in AI, and there's a huge amount of brain power going into researching this. If you kind of talk to, there's 2 interesting podcasts I listened to. One was with Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of NVIDIA, and the other guy, I can't remember the name, Christoph, someone who's the CEO of ASML, who make the printing presses for microchips. This is a Dutch company. And they were both talking about what's coming down the pipeline in terms of hardware. And there's a huge amount of capacity and compute capacity coming. And we're only at the beginning of a process in terms of how much they're going to be able to, how much more compute power is coming at us. So we're going to get ever more sophisticated models. The NVIDIAs of the world are going to be there to facilitate all of that. So those models are going to get so sophisticated. And all those kind of teething problems I'm describing right now, I'm sure they'll disappear in time. Because, part of it is when we all interact with ChatGPT, we're effectively training it. It's learning from us, So it's going to continue to get better. Where the world ends up, on what timeline, it could be 5, 10, 15 years, I don't know. I think you'll still have kind of low-level systems engineers. You'll still need some very deep technical type people. Because ultimately, all those AI systems will need to be written in some code. They'll need to run on servers. You'll need people to build the microchips. So all of that world will still exist. But I think when you go into something like a hedge fund or any other type of business, where you're not really kind of a low-level systems person, you're the kind of application developer building applications to solve the business problems. I think some of those skills about understanding the business and understanding the business problems and being able to be the business analyst. So the business analyst could ultimately evolve into being the developer,
or the developer into the business analyst.
Yeah, but what could ultimately happen is, I could be way off in this one, but the way I've thought about it is, if you look at the current process, if you go back 10 years, you do some business analysis, you define the problem, you write a spec, that goes to the programmer writes some C++ code. But the C++ code, it means nothing to a microchip. So ultimately everything runs in a microchip. The C++ code is just an intermediate state. So then that goes through a compiler and it goes through a couple of other states and it ends up as what's called object code, which is what the microchip on the board inside the computer understands. So C++ is an intermediate state. You could end up with someone describing a problem to a large language model, and you might have to write quite a detailed structured spec, and put in the maths or whatever behind it. Ultimately, you may not care if it implements it in C++ or Python or Java. It may not be relevant to the person typing it in. And ultimately, over time, maybe those languages become less relevant. Maybe, who knows, ultimately, the large language model can compile English language or French or German into something a microchip understands and can run. Maybe that's where it gets to. And maybe it's all about, it's about solving business problems now.
Yeah.
And then you'll still have technical people, but they'll be the kind of service providers providing the infrastructure.
So they're going to be more like orchestrators of tech that need to understand tech in order to orchestrate, but they also need to understand the business and be able to communicate with the business. So I guess more of the traditional successful hedge fund profile is probably going to become more and more in vogue and relevant and needed in wider organizations.
Yeah. And, I mean, I could be completely wrong, but I see the future looking something like that. And how long it takes to get there, I don't know. And it'll be a non-linear path to it. But I think ultimately, I mean, if you listened, I remember it was the interview with Jensen Huang. He effectively said that. He said it in a somewhat different way, but he has effectively said anyone can be a programmer now.
Yeah. And we see this now, like, one of the reasons this is called the top 10% is because from what I see, looking at companies, all the companies are targeting a really tiny portion of the same amount of people. And if someone is not in that group of people, it's a very different marketplace for them. The phone's not really ringing. And all of these requirements are centering on this very rounded kind of T-shaped profile skill set where we don't need someone who's really like narrow and deep in C++ anymore. Like we need them to be really skilled in that, but we also need them to have this and have this and have communication skills and a big picture of like, why am I here and what am I actually doing? And then that ability to, get stuff done in that environment and understand like, we're not trying to engineer the perfect solution. We need to build stuff that works and be able to talk to people and understand their pressures. All the things that we've been talking about, that's playing out from what I see in terms of how people hire now. And it's why it's so much harder to hire because a lot of it's harder to assess. But it's already happening and it sounds like it's only going to happen more and more and more. So it'll be interesting how it plays out for people that are coming from a technical ilk that maybe aren't currently in a position where they have that skill set. Can they create it? Can they develop it within themselves and then present it versus, what's the alternative? But look, I know you're a busy man. That seems like an ominous note to end it on. So we might as well end it there. But look, I thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And I think we probably need to do another one.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Connor White, thank you very much.
You're welcome.